Welcome, everyone. We'll wait just another minute for everyone to join. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat as we get started, as people are joining. We'd love to know who you are and where you live and what your Daf Yomi status is, whether you've been learning all of Masechet Shabbat, whether you've been in the Daf Yomi train for a while, whether you're just Daf Yomi curious. Please share in the chat, and we'll get started in just a minute as we give people time to join. Again, more people are joining, so as you're joining, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're from, what your Daf Yomi status is. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, guys, we'll wait just 2 more minutes as people continue to join, and then we'll get started on the Siyum, so stay tuned. And as I mentioned, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. It would be fun to see where everyone's joining from and where you're at in your Daf Yomi learning. Thanks for joining, everyone. We'll start in just about 30 seconds. So if you have friends who are meant to be here, let them know. Please introduce yourself in the chat, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we're going to get started. So thank you all so much for joining. My name is Sara Wolkenfeld. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria. I'm located in Chicago, and I have been in and out of the Daf Yomi cycle for a lot of years now. I tend to jump in when a tractate seems interesting, and then jump out again when it feels like too much. But since this past summer, I've been on the Daf Yomi train pretty consistently, and I'm so excited to finish Masechet Shabbat with all of you today. I also want to introduce my colleague. Chavet Semach is Sefaria's marketing communications manager, and I'm really glad that she's here to help host this event today. She'll be keeping an eye on the chat, and she'll be here to share links with you and also relay any questions that you might have. So I hope that if you have questions or issues along the way, I hope that you'll share them in the chat. I will be pausing to get that feedback and answer some of those questions as we go along. So please feel free to keep those coming. If you've been in the world of Daf Yomi for a while, then you've probably noticed that Masechet Shabbat is a long Masechet. It is a very long tractate, 157 pages, and it's hard also. Brachot, the first tractate in the Daf Yomi cycle, was shorter and also in a lot of ways easier. Had a lot more stories and a lot more anecdotes. And Shabbat has a lot of that as well, but is also heavier on the legal content. So today's really a day to celebrate, and I hope that wherever you are and whatever your Daf Yomi status, you're feeling that celebration of Talmud that's kind of in the air for all of us today. We're going to begin with a brief overview of Masechet Shabbat, a brief overview of the tractate, so that we can remember where we've been, kind of look back at the long road we've traveled. And then we'll learn the last small section of the tractate together, and then celebrate by reciting the beginning of the Hadran, which is a special prayer for completing a major work of Torah. looking back at a Masechet that you've studied over the course of so many days can be really challenging. And I think especially with this tractate, which if you are kind of tracking your pandemic dates, this tractate began in early March, right around the time when a lot of things around the country were shutting down, actually in a lot of countries. And so that feels like a very long time ago. It was 157 days ago. And it can be hard maybe to kind of take yourself back and remember what was happening then and what was happening in the Daf, and sort of trace that process. But it's really a lot of fun to do this on Sefaria. Sefaria has a page called the Link Explorer, which is one of my favorite pages on Sefaria. This link will go out in the chat. And it's a great way to get a bird's eye view of any Masechet or any book of the Bible. And I'm sure that the print is kind of tiny on the screen, but what this Link Explorer is showing you is all of the connections between the Talmud, which is the words running across the bottom of my screen here. That's all the tractates of the Talmud. And the Tanakh, which is all of the books of the Bible running across the top of the screen. And every time you see a line, that's a time when the Talmud quotes from the Bible. So this is a fun tool to use in a lot of ways. I want to zero in on Tractate Shabbat, on Masechet Shabbat. So I'm clicking on Shabbat down at the bottom. And what you're seeing now is all of the connections between the Talmud and the entire Bible, but specifically the Talmud in Masechet Shabbat. You've probably noticed, if you've been studying along or reading summaries or listening to podcasts, that Shabbat, like all tractates of the Talmud, frequently quotes from the Bible. And in fact, because our engineers are amazing, I know that there are 827 references to Tanakh in Tractate Shabbat. I'll pause for a minute while you guess. What book of the Bible do you think is most often quoted in Masechet Shabbat? You have a lot to pick from. You can maybe be guided by the lines up here. It's not so easy to see sort of casually, but which book of the Bible do you think is most quoted by Tractate Shabbat? I can't see your guesses, but I'll pause while hopefully they pour in. It's a fun thing to guess because it might be influenced by the verse or set of verses that you most remember, or the topic that you most remember from within your study of Tractate Shabbat. Did everybody have a chance to guess? I've tried this on a few different people so far. Some people have gotten it almost right. Nobody's gotten it completely right. But I'll tell you that if you guessed Shmot, the book of Exodus, or Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, then we'll count all of you as having been correct. You're basically right. There are 127 references from Shmot and 123 from Sefer Vayikra, which means that if I were to zero in here on either Exodus or Leviticus, and again, that's showing all the times each one of those lines is a time when Masechet Shabbat quotes from one of those books. So that's where the heaviest concentration would be. And I thought it would be interesting, by way of looking back at this tractate, to use a few of the most frequently quoted verses, a few of the psukim that show up the most in this tractate, and use that as a lens to look back at the entire Masechet. As I go through those verses, which I've chosen again with the help of our engineers because they're the most often quoted, I'd love to hear from you. You can put into the chat if there's a pasuk that you especially remember seeing quoted. Maybe you'll guess one of the ones that I'm about to speak about. Or maybe it didn't come up frequently, but it stands out for you. You were especially interested in it, or interested in the way that the Talmud used it, which is not always necessarily the same as the way that the verse appears in context. So go ahead and put that in the chat also. Again, you have 827 different references to pick from, so maybe you'll remember which one was most meaningful for you. The most frequently cited verse in this entire tractate is Leviticus 12:3, which I'll let you look up on your own if you want to. I'm not going to speak about it because I think it's not actually the most exciting. The pasuk goes as follows: Uvayom hashemini yimol basar orlato. On the 8th day, you should circumcise the baby's skin. So that obviously is a reference to Brit Milah, to circumcision. And if you can remember back, actually not that long ago, it was just a few months ago, there was an entire parak, an entire chapter of Masechet Shabbat that really deals pretty much exclusively with with circumcision, and specifically how circumcision squares or doesn't square with Shabbat observance. So if you can remember that, then you'll know that those however many daf, that whole chapter pretty much revolves around questions of circumcision. And so it makes sense that that verse is quoted a lot, but it's not, they don't do a huge number of different things with it. It's always in the context of circumcision. So I decided, since that's focused entirely in one chapter, that I wouldn't spend a lot of time, but you can look at that if you were to click on Leviticus at the top. So now you're looking at just the connections between Leviticus and Masechet Shabbat. And so you kind of have to hover over, but you would see it right around here, 12:3, and you would start seeing a lot of concentrated quotes towards the end of the Masechet. That's where you'll see that verse. And if you hover over any one of these lines, you can see exactly the quote, and you can click to open it. So if that was your favorite, and that was the one that resonated most, then I apologize for not going into detail on that one. But there's two others that I'd like us to take some time to explore today. One of them is Leviticus 4:27. So see if this looks familiar to you. V'im nefesh achat techata bishgaga, if any person sins unknowingly, unwittingly, me'am haaretz, or among the populace, ba'asota achat mitzvot Adonai asher lo ta'asena ve'ashem, because they did one of the mitzvot of God that you're not supposed to do. They did one of the don't do's, and then the person recognizes their guilt. This pasuk comes up a number of times, a large number of times, one of the largest number of times in Masechet Shabbat. And as always, if you click on Sefaria's resource bar, I'm going to close it so I can reopen it. If you click to open the pasuk and then you click on Talmud, you'll be able to see all the references actually in the entire Talmud. And clicking on Shabbat will take me to all of the times when this pasuk is referenced, specifically in Masechet Shabbat. So it'll take us kind of back to the beginning if we open up that first time that this verse is quoted. It's talking about carrying, which is a great frame of mind to be in if you're going to also be starting Masechet Eruvin, if you're going to start the next tractate. I'll talk about that at the end, which is kind of all about carrying in a sense. But if you remember way back at the beginning of Masechet Shabbat, that's what we were talking about. We were talking about carrying. And this part of the Gemara talks about how if two people do the carrying together, they haven't really accomplished the melacha. And that's learned out, it's drawn out from this verse because it says ba'asota. It says that this is, you're guilty if you do the thing. And if you only do part of the thing, then you haven't really done the action. You haven't really fully engaged in the melacha. So part of what this pasuk does for us, even though it seems like it's about guilt and unwitting guilt and things like that, it's about that also. But the very first function of this verse in the context of Masechet Shabbat is to tell you that you have to be fully in control of the action. You have to be the sole proprietor of the action in order for it to really count in terms of having violated Shabbat. The second time that it's used, I'm going to go through those steps again and open it up in Masechet Shabbat. The second time that it's used is in a slightly different context. This goes to the question of what counts as shgaga, what counts as doing something by accident, and what doesn't. And if you were still in the daf cycle for these last few days, then you know that the end of the tractate really circles back a little bit to the question of, like, what does it look like to do it on purpose, and what the punishment is. I would say up until that point, Tractate Shabbat doesn't dwell on doing things on purpose, but they do spend a lot of time asking exactly what it is that you have to not know, or exactly what it is that you have to have forgotten in order for something to really count as being accidental, this word shgaga. So I pulled the verse from here where it gets quoted on 69a, that you've done something accidental. And the verse says, "Asher lo ta'asena bishgaga ve'ashem," that you've done it accidentally, something that wasn't supposed to be done, and now you're guilty. But you did it by accident, and then you realize your guilt. And the whole section here is playing with this idea of what was it that you forgot, and what was it that you then remembered. And this comes up again and again in this section. Later in the tractate, you have, again, a reference to two people doing an action together. So that comes up. That's here later on. So a few references to doing things by accident. And then on 92b, you have another conversation about doing things together, that if you carry things together with another person and you were unable to do it by yourself, then again, you're not fully chayav, you're not fully guilty in the fullest sense of having transgressed this melacha. I think it's interesting, it comes up again and again, this idea of what is it to really do a labor? What is it to really have accomplished something? And you'll see that we'll circle back to this at the end of the tractate. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to talk about one more pasuk, one more verse that I think really kind of stretches through the tractate and informs a lot of it. And then I'll pause for your questions, so feel free to keep them coming in. Another frequently cited pasuk in this tractate, and this actually has been a few people's guess in terms of most cited. It's not the most cited, but it's up there, is the pasuk from Yeshayahu, the pasuk from Isaiah. Im tashiv mishabat raglecha, asot chafatzecha b'yom kodshi, v'karata l'shabat oneg, l'kdosh Adonai mechubad, v'chibadeto me'asot zerechecha, mimtzo chavtzecha v'daber davar. It's a long verse. There's a lot in there. If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your affairs on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath delight, the Lord's holy day honored, and if you honor it and go not your ways, nor look to your affairs, nor strike bargains. This verse doesn't show up until we're pretty far into Masechet Shabbat. You can see that the first reference is 113a, and I'm going to open that up. But I think it's a really important theme of the tractate overall, even though it doesn't show up. It doesn't take us all the way back to the beginning. It only shows up midway through. The verse is broken down piece by piece by the Gemara. And the Talmud tells us, this idea of honoring it or showing kavod, showing honor to Shabbat. You shouldn't wear the same clothes on Shabbat as you wear during the week. And then you shouldn't walk the same way on Shabbat as you do during the week. And your own affairs are forbidden, but you can do the work of heaven on Shabbat. And daber davar, also that you can't speak on Shabbat the same way as you speak during the rest of the week. And I think this is a theme that really does run, especially through the end of the tractate, where we start talking about the category of what's sometimes called shvut, the category of things that don't fit neatly into one melacha or another, but are rabbinically prohibited because kind of feels like a weekday thing to do and not a Shabbat thing to do. And that might be the part of the tractate most where you're thinking, these are not things that I do even on a regular basis, because they're things about like burdening and unburdening animals and stuff like that. The trick for these parts of the tractate is to kind of translate them into language that makes sense for our daily lives. And I think that this section really does a good job of speaking kind of universally, not about specific actions, but making us stop and think about what it is that distinguishes Shabbat for us, what it is that makes it special in our lives, whether it's clothing or the way you speak or a specific action that you take, or one fun thing that you do. And that's really a theme, like I said, that runs through this tractate. So you can see it comes up in a few different places as well. Later on Daf Kuf Yud Tet, so 119, I think that this is an especially fun section where you hear about the way the different rabbis would engage with Shabbat. And so here you see that Rav Papa, who we'll mention again, if you read the full Hadran, you would see Rav Papa mentioned. So Rav Papa Bar Abba said to Rav Papa, like, we eat fancy food all the time, basically. So how are we going to distinguish Shabbat? And the answer is, well, you have to do something different, right? If your meal, they were saying before, if your meal is earlier, make it later. If your meal is later, make it earlier. Right? You have to do something that will kind of distinguish your Shabbat meal from other meals. And you can see that this continues, again, just going in and clicking to open the different related sections here on the side. This even came up just a few days ago, let's see, 150, so just about a week ago, where it circles back to this idea of what it means to not pursue your own business on Shabbat. So even indirectly, kind of hinting at things that are going to get your business ahead on Shabbat might be problematic, according to the Talmud, but something like marrying off your children or teaching children or something that, again, is L'Shem Shemayim, speaks to the greater good, the greater need in the world, communal matters, those things are permissible, even on Shabbat, because they're in keeping with this pasuk, again, from Yeshayahu, about the proper way to treat Shabbat, the proper way to kind of rejoice on Shabbat. I want to pause now for people's questions or reflections, anything else that you would want to throw into the mix about what's most important, or questions that I can answer using Sefaria's tools or not. So I'm going to pause, and Chava, my colleague, is going to share any questions or comments from the chat.
All right. We have a question here from Janine, who wants to know about translating the very last line of today's daf, the last daf of Shabbat. And yeah,
I promise to get there.
Okay.
We'll do the end of Shabbat in just a second. So thanks, Janine. I'm excited to translate. I'll do my best. But I'll hold off on that for one sec, just to see if there's any questions or comments about this part.
All right. It looks like we don't have any other questions, so I think we can keep going.
Great. So we'll keep going. We'll go over to the end of the tractate now. Just noting that I think that all of these themes will be important to keep in mind. Both the question of how you define a labor, how you define a melacha, as well as what makes Shabbat special, as well as what it looks like to forget and do something accidentally. All of these are going to play out when we start Masechet Eruvin. I hope some of you are in it for the whole journey. Eruvin is hard, but it's going to be great. And we'll be talking specifically about carrying on Shabbat. So hold on to these themes. And I hope when the time comes to update you on which verses and themes were most prevalent in that tractate when the time comes. So I'm going to navigate to the very end of Tractate Shabbat. Oh, I see the untranslated line, and I promise to get there. I'm going to start with the last piece. If you are getting used to the rhythm of Talmud, or you're already used to it, then you've noticed that the Gemara's kind of MO is to quote a little bit of the Mishnah and then discuss it. Although they sometimes get pretty far afield. Here, there's not so much time. They don't go so far. So the Mishnah talked about a case where people stopped up a window. They used an earthenware vessel to stop up a window. And then they tied an earthenware shard with a long piece of reed grass. So that was the story, or the incident in the Mishnah. And now the Gemara is going to kind of give you a fuller picture on that. So here's what happened. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, there was a little, small, I guess probably narrow alleyway between two houses. And there was ritual impurity there. Ritual impurity, also a big theme of Masechet Shabbat. Not enough time to talk about that one today, but I think it's really fascinating. They're really concerned about ritual impurity. There was presumably a dead body in that alleyway, and so the idea is that they want to now stop the tum'ah, they want to stop the impurity from getting inside their houses. The gigitz duka munachat al gabat. There was a cracked roof that was over the alleyway of these two houses. So it went over both houses and it went over the small alleyway as well. If that roof were to be intact, it would be a really strong transmitter of tum'ah. The impurity would fill up all the space covered by that roof. So here's what they did. So they stopped up the windows with this earthenware vessel to keep the impurity from getting in through the windows. And they tied this piece of earthenware on this long string to see if the hole in that roof was tefach wide, was a hand's breadth wide or not. I guess they measured the piece of earthenware, and then they could use that to kind of measure this hole in the roof and see whether it was a large enough hole to let out the ritual impurity. So that fills in the story of the Mishnah. And then the Gemara concludes, Umidivrehen lambadnu shepokukin umodudin v'koshrin b'shabbat. From their words, from these statements, we learn three things. You can stop up a window on Shabbat, you can measure on Shabbat, and you can tie on Shabbat, because they had to do all three of those actions in order to accomplish this whole blocking of impurity measuring feat. Ula ikla leberesh galuta. Ula went to the house of the exilarch, the head of the galut in Babylonia. Chazia l'Rabba bar Rav Huna diyativ ba'avna demaya, the kamash achlai. And he saw, strange sight, Rabba bar Rav Huna, another rabbi, sitting in a tub of water and kind of measuring the water. Amar le, Amar d'amri rabbanim medida de mitzvah, delav mitzvah mi amor. So Ula said to him, okay, I understand that you're allowed to measure on Shabbat when it's a mitzvah, but you're not doing any mitzvah, so who says you're allowed to do that? Amar le, mitz asek ba'alma ana. And Rabbi Rav Huna says back to him, I'm just I'm merely acting unawares. That's the translation that we have. I'm merely acting unawares. This category of mitzasek means that you're kind of distracted. You're not actually trying to accomplish the measuring in this case. It's not something that you're consciously doing. You're just kind of keeping busy here. And so it's not a problem. It's not a full labor. Again, going back to this idea about defining what a labor really is, and this doesn't meet that bar. Again, one of the things that I think runs through the Masechet is this idea that the Steinsaltz translation, which we're so lucky to have, Rav Adin Steinsaltz, may his memory be a blessing, passed away just a few days ago. We're so lucky that we have his translation on Sefaria, and he translates throughout the tractate. He translates milacha as labor, which I think is a good word. Sometimes it's translated as work, and that's also too broad. But one thing that I hope you've seen throughout the tractate is that there's a pretty high bar set for what actually constitutes a full-out milacha, a full-out labor. If you're distracted, if you're kind of doing it just for fun, you don't actually care about the outcome, then that doesn't fully count as a labor, and so it's not a problem to have engaged with that. And then this last line, which is not really part of the text of the Talmud, which is why I think it's not translated, but it's a good request to have it translated on our site. Hadran alach mishehchich. We will return to you the name of the chapter, mishehchich, the one for whom it got dark while they were on the way. V'slika la Masechet Shabbat. And we've completed Tractate Shabbat. The end is kind of another way of saying that. That's the end of the tractate, and that's always how every chapter ends, with a little postscript like that. We will return to you, and then the name of the chapter, and the tractates always end with that idea of we've completed it, and also this Hadran. So I'm going to read the beginning of the Hadran text, which you can find on Sefaria, and you can see it here on my screen. It's the prayer that we always say when completing a tractate, just the beginning of it. This word Hadran, typically translated as we will return to you. That's the translation we have here. The idea being, and if you just finished Tractate Shabbat and you're thinking, phew, then I'm sorry to break the news to you, but the idea is someday we'll return to this material. Someday we'll learn it again, we'll understand new things. And so we want to celebrate that and recognize that, and you'll return to us, you, the tractate. We speak to the tractate as a companion here, as something that we're relating to. You'll also return to us. Another possible translation of that word hadar here is glory or beauty. We feel so blessed and so adorned to have engaged with this material, and it kind of feels similarly. So Hadran alach Masechet Shabbat v'hadrach alan, da'atan alach Masechet Shabbat v'da'atach alan. We'll return to you, Tractate Shabbat. You'll return to us. Our mind is on you, Tractate Shabbat, and your mind is on us. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Shabbat v'lo titnashe minan, lo ba'alma hadain v'lo ba'alma da'ati. We won't forget you, Tractate Shabbat, and you won't forget us, not in this world and not in the world to come. Because we've engaged in this study over the course of months, this study is now a part of us. This tractate is now a part of us, and we can return to it whenever we choose, but it's always going to be a part of us going forward in our lives. So Mazel Tov, you did it. Whether you've been in it all the way or in it part of the way, or you're just joining now, congratulations. We're so excited to be celebrating this with you. And finally, I'll say that if you love the Daf, or even if you're thinking you might love the Daf, if you're Daf curious, I hope you'll join us tomorrow to kickstart Tractate Eruvin with an experiment in long distance learning. You can join us for Daf Roulette. It's going to be tomorrow evening, as I said, on Tuesday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. It's a fun new tool that our engineers have built. You'll get instantly matched with a chavruta or a study partner for some face-to-face Daf Yomi learning. And the only thing that you need to have in advance in order to be able to do this is you need to sign up for a free Sefaria account if you don't already have one, so that you can participate in this fun event. So I thank you all so much for joining us today. I think I'll stick around for a few more minutes to see if there's any questions, but I hope that you'll enjoy being part of the Daf Yomi community on Sefaria. And we hope to see you at future Siyum, future celebrations. So thank you guys.
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Just to clarify about Daf Roulette, you don't have to do anything to sign up or RSVP for this event. Only have a Sefaria account. And if you have a Sefaria account, it usually means you're also on our email list. So we will send you by email the link to participate in Daf Roulette about an hour before it starts. So we hope to see you tomorrow for that event. And Sarah, we had one question that I saw come up, wondering if you know the answer to this. Which book in Nach is most quoted in Tractate Shabbat?
It's a great question. I don't know, but I think you could figure it out by spending a little bit of time with this visualizer. So it would be a fun, I guess if you figure out the answer, you can let us know. I think that, yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. If I had to guess, I think I might say Psalms but it's not fair really because it's the biggest book. So maybe that's like gives it an unfair advantage. But at any given time, I think I would guess Psalms.
All right. If you had any questions that were unanswered today, please feel free to email us anytime at hello@sefaria.org. And we will do our best to answer your questions and point you in the direction of resources to help you figure out how to utilize Sefaria better for your learning. So thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks.